Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, School Improvement Under ESSA, How States Are Adjusting and What It Means for Your Business. We really appreciate your joining us today, and we're looking forward to the program. Before we get started, I'm going to review just a few quick housekeeping items. We obviously have a lot of information to cover about what's happening with the state's ESSA plans, so we're going to definitely leave time at the end of the presentation for your questions. You can go ahead and send those questions in as they come up for you, and we'll put them into the queue to be answered at the end. To send a question, simply click on the Questions tab on your control panel, type your question in the top box, and click on the Send button. I'll get that question, and as I said, I'll put it in the queue to be answered during the Q&A period. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that same question feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be providing you with a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the PowerPoint slides. They are information-packed, so scribble notes throughout the webinar, but also know that you'll be able to get a copy of those either later today or tomorrow. We'll send you an email with a link to access the recording and to download the webinar slides. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Doug Mesecar. Doug has a diverse background, having held senior operational and policy roles at leading education companies, the U.S. Department of Education, and in Congress. Doug is currently Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy for IO Education. In this role, he oversees IO Education's professional growth solutions, including educator effectiveness, professional learning, and principal leadership. He also helps inform and direct IO's strategic business direction across all products and functions. During his time with the U.S. Department of Education, Doug held a number of senior roles, including Deputy Chief of Staff of the Department, Assistant Deputy Secretary for the Office of Innovation and Improvement, and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. During his time on Capitol Hill, Doug was a professional staff member for the Education and Workforce Committee in the House of Representatives. In addition to his work with IO, Doug also writes on education technology and policy for the Lexington Institute and mentors EdTech startups through GSC Labs. Doug attended Hope College and the University of Denver, where he completed graduate work in education and earned his teaching license. He went on to teach 5th grade in the Jefferson County school system in Colorado and currently lives near Washington, D.C. with his wife, children, and dogs. We are pleased to have Doug with us back again today. He definitely is an expert on ESSA and is going to unpack a lot of what is starting to unfold from the state plans. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to him now.
Well, great, and thank you for that introduction. I think the summary for me is I've been around education for a few years and picked up a few things along the way. Hopefully, I will give you some more insights into how the states are reacting specifically to the school improvement provisions in ESSA. If you can believe, it's been 2 years almost since ESSA passed at the end of 2015. And so today we're going to dive into the provisions of the law, but with a distinct state focus. 15 of the first 17 ESSA plans have been approved. 2 more are in the wings. Michigan and Colorado are still waiting to be approved. And then all 34 states have come in, even the states that got waivers because of the hurricanes. And the secretary announced, I think it was in the last few days, that all 34 state plans are ready for review. So we won't have another Michigan situation, we don't expect, where the state basically was told to try again and resubmit. So we're going to cover today comprehensive support and improvement schools, targeted support and improvement. We're also going to look at the timeline. So when are these schools going to be identified? We'll talk some around school improvement funds. There's been a number of changes there. One of the big areas of change from the waivers and from NCLB is around evidence-based intervention requirements. We'll talk about the role of private providers, as well as how do schools exit or get out of the status that they're in. And then finally, as discussed before, we'll have some time for questions. So a lot to cover. Let's dive right in. The first slide, though, I just want to remind you and set the context that, as I said earlier, I've been around for a while, worked on NCLB, was actually on the Hill before NCLB when IASA was still the law of the land, the Improving America Schools Act. And, you know, things change, obviously, and policy swings in reaction to lots of different influences. So there's no political statement in this particular sort of graphic. It's only meant to show that we had NCLB. The waivers kind of pulled back in some areas. They added a few requirements in other areas, but clearly ESSA is a swing in the opposite direction. So don't read anything into this other than we've moved. And I would say ESSA is much more in the spirit of IASA, which predated NCLB. And the question is, you know, how often and how quickly and how wide will this pendulum swing from side to side in the future? Part of that will depend on how states react to the changes and what they decide to do in their plans. So NCLB, all of you probably remember this. It was the law of the land for a number of years, but we had a very distinct process, a regimented school improvement process with AYP. I know that's like a 3-letter word for some of you, and it's sort of completely gone away now, so there's no more AYP. But if you remember, we had school improvement, corrective action, restructuring, and you kind of progress down this hierarchy of more and more severe and intense interventions. And of course, we had the mandated supplemental educational services, the free educational tutoring that came along with that. And under the Obama administration waivers, that changed pretty radically to the priority and focus schools. And so, you know, we kind of collapsed that old structure into 2 categories. And some of the requirements, most notably around SES, went away. There was more flexibility given. And then when you look at ESSA, it's really a continuation in many respects of the policies under priority and focus schools, where you're always looking at the bottom 5% of schools. And you're also looking at high schools with a particularly low graduation rate. Now, ESSA changed that from the waiver policy. And then you have targeted support and improvement, which is similar to focus. So there's some continuity here from waivers to ESSA, but really a pretty big sea change from NCLB. And one way to think about this as you're grappling with all of these changes is priority schools really are similar to comprehensive support and improvement. So if you're thinking about, well, which schools are these and are they similar? And yes, they are. In many state plans, the priority schools are being transferred or being looked at similarly for comprehensive support and improvement, or CSI. And then the focus schools kind of are the equivalent to targeted support and improvement, or TSI schools. So you can kind of see the progression there. This was from actually DC's application under ESSA, this little graphic. This is an important note, though. As you again may recall under NCLB, more and more schools were being identified as needing improvement and corrective action and restructuring as the timeline toward proficiency, 100% proficiency, was advancing. But then you kind of see the peak in 2011-12, and then it started to decrease as the waivers took effect. And then you see this huge kind of drop off with ESSA taking effect. And so there's going to be fewer schools identified, the idea being that let's really hone in on the schools that need the most help and really focus on improving them and not spread ourselves so thin across all of these schools that need some sort of impact or some sort of intervention to try to impact their performance. So just keep kind of this in mind as we go forward. It's a smaller group of schools that are getting more intense intervention. So beyond sort of the carry forward from the priority and focus from the waiver policies, let's talk a little bit about how we're actually defining comprehensive school improvement and targeted support and improvement, So comprehensive support and improvement has to happen at least once every 3 years. So that's a big change, right? We have to identify these schools on a sort of 3-year rolling cycle. Now, it could be that states choose to do it differently, and some will, but that's sort of the minimum expectation. Again, lowest 5% of Title I schools as determined by the state's accountability system, right? So even the priority and focus schools had a little bit different approach to that. Now it's how is the state implementing accountability? How are they identifying the lowest 5%? And then you have the high schools with graduation rates below 67%. And then it can also include targeted support and improvement schools that fail to improve over that 3 years. So you really have 3 categories of schools that could fall into this criteria. Now, there's some disagreement, I would say, some lack of clarity, maybe is a better way of saying it. Do you have 5% plus the high schools that's 67% below, plus the TSI, so you could wind up with more than 5%? I would say, particularly since the accountability regulations were thrown out by Congress, to me, that's not entirely clear. It's an area that I'm going to try to get more detail on. But by and large, you're talking about the bottom 5%, give or take a few schools one way or the other. So targeted support and improvement is really focused on subgroups. So you're looking at consistently underperforming subgroups or a subgroup. And how is that defined? Well, there's some variability in how states are approaching this. Kind of the bare minimum is saying that a school will be identified for targeted support and improvement if they have a subgroup that's performing at the same level as a school, meaning the all-student subgroup of a comparable school, or an equivalent subgroup in schools. So it's a comparative look to say, do we have a subgroup or subgroups in a school that's performing poorly and performing poorly over time? We're going to identify them for this targeted support and improvement. Now, some states have tried to kind of cap this number at like a 10%, like the prior waiver policy with how it was with the 5% and the 10%. So far, the feds have not really gone along with that approach. North Dakota is an example there where they were sort of trying to cap that number, and the department basically said, no, you can't really cap it in that way. You've got to just identify schools that meet your criteria for identification. So what states are doing, right, you can kind of see the loophole there, is they're defining this in a way that kind of winds up in the same place without putting a cap in place. So in a lot of respects, you still have that 5 and 10% mentality kind of playing through the state plans. Okay, so let's do a quick refresher on ESSA accountability. So the state's accountability system, you know, it's going to combine these different elements in different ways, but it has to meaningfully differentiate schools and LEAs on an annual basis. So you're looking at annual scores and performance, but you're only identifying usually once every 3 years. And so the annual determinations will come into play later as we talk about exiting and showing progress. But if you recall, you've got the proficiency on state assessments, grad rates for high schools, one other indicator of school quality or success, participation rate. Now, this one's interesting because states have handled this in different ways. I read the law as saying that participation rate has to be included in the identification of schools for CSI and TSI. Some states have taken a different approach and said they're going to look at it, they're going to factor it in, but they're not really looking that closely at 95% participation rate to say that's a trigger. If you miss that, then you're going to be identified. You've got English language proficiency and then growth or another indicator. So remember now, you've got all these indicators coming together, and schools are going to be reporting data, collecting the data, trying to improve against all these different data points, which leads to the question of, well, if you've got all this data and different ways of looking at the data, how does this come together? Well, lots of different types of approaches that states have taken. What I show you here is something Center for American Progress had put something together where it was just kind of an illustrative example, because if you remember the law, the academic indicators have to get sort of more substantial weight than the non-academic indicators. And what that means in practice in terms of actual definable policy is unclear because the law is unclear. And again, we don't have regulation. So states have taken different approaches, but you can see in this model, it's more of a hypothetical achievement in math and reading, and then a growth measure here, take 50%. Then you've got grad rate, ELP, college and career ready. Now, most states have not taken sort of this kind of very kind of normalized model. They're a little bit all over the map. And the second pie chart here is looking at elementary and middle. And of course, you've got slightly different indicators, whether you're high school or elementary and middle. But again, you can see the achievement is the greater weight here of the total amount. So how do states start to put this together into actual identification? Well, you can see at the bottom there, there's at least 4 different approaches and some combo approaches where some states are doing an index, some states are doing more of a goal-based model that's kind of similar to an AYP model, but not exactly the same. Some are putting it all together in a matrix, you know, the matrix, it's all kind of, you know, glowy letters going down your screen. It's hard to understand. And then some states are looking at a dashboard model. California is probably the leading advocate of this approach, where that they're not actually coming up with a single way of summarizing this, because remember, you have to come up with a single summative rating for schools. Some states like Tennessee are translating that into a letter grade. Other states are coming up with a score of some type. And then there's other states, we'll see if it passes muster with the department, because California is part of the next tranche here that just came in, where they don't really assign a single score, but they have a really complicated system for identifying the lowest 5%. We'll see how that plays out. I'm not going to spend any more time on this. It gets really wonky and really complicated really fast, but just a couple of examples here. So this is a pretty straightforward approach to weighting the indicators and how much, you know, if you're using a point value system, how much does that make of the total? This second example here that just came on the screen is actually New York. And New York is using more of a decision tree model where they're kind of looking at, okay, what's your level in achievement and graduation rate? Then they're combining that. Then they're looking at the English language and saying, well, if you score anywhere, like if you're really good on English language proficiency, but you're a 1 on achievement and graduation rate, then you're automatically identified for comprehensive support and improvement. It's complicated. I don't think it's necessarily what the law had envisioned, and I don't know how you would explain that to parents and stakeholders in the community, but this is the way New York has approached it. So going through this process, they're going to get to their bottom 5%, and then they'll also have a way of looking at their targeted schools and improvement to schools above that cutoff. Now that I've got you pretty confused on that, I'm sure, on indicators and weighting and identification, when do they have to do it? So they've got a system in place that's been approved by the feds. So this is Oregon, who's been approved. And you can see here, there's pretty standard definitions of CSI and TSI. Now, interestingly, they are choosing to identify in 17-18, right? That's this school year. Now, you can do that under ESSA, but you can also push it out a year to 18-19. So you can see here that they're kind of rolling forward their process from 17-18 onward, but it just gives you a feel for when they're going to identify. They're looking at the data. Then they're starting to develop their plan. Then in 18-19 is actually implementation, and then they've got 3 years of going through the process, and then they're going to go through a re-identification. So this is how Oregon chose to do it. Most states are doing a version of what I'm showing you right here, which is a little bit more comprehensive look at. So based on 17-18 data, states are going to identify schools starting next school year, 18-19, and that's really when ESSA is really, I call it the first bite here at the apple, or the first bite, you know, where it really kind of starts to get real traction and really cause some change and some distress, is 18-19. LEA and SEA report cards have to be published. Funds are going to be distributed to the schools, and we'll get into fund distribution in a minute. And then some states are requiring implementation, the intervention process to start that school year, and some are pushing it out, and the department has allowed 18-19, the year of identification, to be the planning year, and 19-20 to be the year when implementation actually has to start. Now, a couple of points here. So the SEA has to notify the LEA of the schools identified for CSI and TSI. And then the SEA has a much more of a role in CSI, where they're involved in improving CSI plans. They're going to be monitoring it. So by the intention of the law, states have to be much more involved with CSI. LEAs, the districts, are going to be much more involved in sort of managing the TSI process. So it's an interesting kind of shared responsibility for the CSI schools. Okay, let's keep plugging along here. Let's talk about the funding. So school improvement funding, I found this great table. And if you look at the net of the dollars that are going to be made available to these schools and to the states and the districts to help turn around these schools, it's hovering around a similar number, but the way it's distributed is massively different. So you remember there was a 4% set aside in Title I under NCLB, under the waivers, and then you had the school improvement grant program, which was a separate appropriation. When you added that all together, you got to this, little over $1 billion. Now for ESSA, it's just a 7% set aside. That's it. You're done. There's no other program. It's a similar amount of money, but the key point here, in my opinion, is, remember that chart from earlier, you have a lot fewer schools that are going to be identified who have access and the potential resources coming to bear of what it used to be. So these dollars are going to be more concentrated. And that's obviously by design, with the idea that let's really hone in, let's focus in on these schools, let's devote more funding and resources to these particular schools. So if we go in a little bit deeper, there's some priorities within the funding. So LEAs, districts serving the highest number or percentage of identified schools, will get priority in funding. Now remember, there's no federal criteria for required interventions, which we'll talk about in a minute, or a particular model that gets priority over another. And there's no longer a cap. Right? Part of the cap was to ensure that the dollars went further. With more dollars and fewer schools, it didn't really make sense to put a cap in place. So there's really no high-end cap. And then there's this issue of, will states distribute the dollars on a formula basis, on a competitive basis, or some combo of both? And you can see here what I've been able to find so far. We've got 6 states who are looking at a more purely competitive basis, where they're going to be doling these. Not every school is going to get the same amount. They're actually going to have to apply for these dollars and make a case for why they should be funded at a particular level. So the pie charts to the right, if you look at all of Title I, you've got the 7% set aside for school improvement. And then the 3% is only there to show that a couple of states, I think New Mexico's one, there may be another, who are going to set aside 3% for direct student services, which is, in a way, it's kind of the latter day version of SES. It's much more open. It's much more around, less around tutoring and how do we give these students personalized support. But not many states are taking advantage of that permissive authority. So you've got 93% that'll be distributed to the districts, 7% that'll be distributed for school improvement. Now, just as an aside, that's a bigger number, right? So the Title I dollars going into school districts are going to be affected until the appropriation catches up, meaning that some districts may get less regular Title I dollars under ESSA than they did before, because now there's a bigger set aside for school improvement. So it's just something to keep in mind. And then of that 7%, 95% of those dollars have to go to districts, and then the state can hold back a portion to do technical assistance and monitoring and the activities that they need to do. So 95% of the 7% is going to wind up in districts in the schools that are identified. Okay, I found this chart. I will try to retrack down the source. I promise I didn't make it up, but this was just an estimate of how many dollars, like the amount of funding each state would receive if you took 7% of their Title I allocation and just said, okay, how many dollars will be available in this state based on the new school improvement formula? So you can see, there are some states based on their relative share of Title I that are going to be getting lots and lots of dollars, and other states not so much, which has a lot to do with the proportion of population and poverty, right? Those are the two probably most important factors driving Title I dollars. Okay, so we've talked about accountability, we've identified the schools, we figured out the funding formula. What do these schools actually have to do? And this is kind of an incremental change over the waiver policy, the priority and focus policy that came before ESSA. It's certainly a long ways away from NCLB, as we talked about before, but you can see here with the comprehensive support and improvement schools, the LEA works with the school and stakeholders. The needs assessment is a big, big deal. So it's throughout the law. It's very much an emphasis of identifying, not just relying purely on the accountability indicators, but identifying what are the needs in the school, perhaps root cause analysis, what's driving the achievement problems that the school is having, and then create an improvement plan that's based on the reasons for identification. So is it a reading problem, a math problem, graduation rate issue? Is it an ELP? Is it a combo of those? And then it has to include evidence-based interventions as well as identifying resource equities. Now, you may remember that ESSA requires districts to publish their spending by school broken down by personnel and non-personnel. And part of the idea here is to show that, hey, maybe these schools are under-resourced, or maybe the distribution of resources is inequitable across the district for other reasons. So there's looking at, are they getting sufficient resources relative to the expectations that have been put on them? And then, again, back to the sort of everybody's involved with CSI, the plan has to be approved by the district and the state and the SEA. Now, there is kind of a ratcheting mechanism that harkens back a little bit to NCLB, and it's this last bullet that basically says, well, what if it doesn't work? Well, the law says after 4 years, you have to do more rigorous intervention, but it never really defines what that means. But basically it says if you've tried something for 3 years and it hasn't moved the needle, you've got to do more and most likely probably different as well. So there is kind of this ratcheting mechanism there that says something's going to happen if you're persistently a CSI school. All right, let's talk about TSI. So similar here, where a school that's identified, again, based on a subgroup or a couple of subgroups, they have to do a needs assessment, create a school improvement plan. Very similar, you have to have evidence-based interventions. Here, the district is approving and monitoring. And then what happens if a TSI school doesn't improve? Well, after 3 years, if it doesn't improve, that 4th year, it's going to become a CSI school. So you will see in a lot of state plans that, the TSI schools that haven't improved after intervention will become CSI schools. So that's that extra category that we talked about earlier. Those are pretty broad, right? Those don't have a lot of definition. That, again, is by design. It's really, again, ESSA is all about power back to the states, power to districts, decision-making locally. Those closest to the kids know what needs to be done. And so the states approached this in lots of different ways. They had, almost a blank slate to think about how they wanted to address these schools. And most of them spent the majority of their time tackling the CSI question. That's the more intense intervention. The state obviously has a role in it. And, that's where most of the dollars are going to be as well. So the states in their ESSA plans, to a varying degree, gave more detail around what they will do with comprehensive support and improvement schools. Connecticut, you can see here they're going to require their 10 lowest performing districts to choose improvement plans from basically a state list that covers different areas, and they want those different areas, whether it's academic, school climate, early learning. So it's this menu of interventions that they consider evidence-based that have to be lined up with why the school got identified. Tennessee, they're proposing that it could be that the lowest performing schools might become part of their achievement school district, the sort of recovery school district analog from Louisiana and New Orleans is, we're going to have a state takeover, basically. They have another model where the district and the state may jointly run low-performing schools, which just seems like a recipe for confusion. And, I highly doubt that will be an option that's exercised very frequently. And then they have interesting ideas around innovation zones or district within districts where you kind of create a sub-district within the broader district to focus on these schools. And then you've got 7 of the first 19 states are providing an actual list of improved interventions or approved outside organizations. So some states are getting very concrete about what this is going to be. And you can see that list here. Now, there'll be many more in this next round. I just haven't had a chance to really dive into the next 34 yet, but I have looked pretty closely at the first 17. So we've got the interventions. They've got to implement evidence-based interventions, but what does that really mean? Well, first of all, the law is full of provisions and mentions of evidence-based. And when you think about it in the context of comprehensive and targeted school improvement, there's a pretty clear requirement in the law that you can only use interventions or strategies that have a statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes or other relevant outcomes based on strong, moderate, or promising evidence. So in this handy-dandy little chart, the areas in blue are areas that you can pick interventions that have evidence-based that meet these criteria for comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement. And you can see the requirements underneath: strong evidence, 1, well-designed and well-implemented experimental studies. So this is randomized control trial type of approach. Moderate evidence, so that's quasi-experimental, so it might have a little random control, but not completely that way. And then promising is where you'll see a lot more interventions because, frankly, there aren't that many interventions that will be able to meet the level of evidence for moderate and strong. And then you've got this other category that I'll talk about more in a minute. It's certainly out there, but this sort of strong theory of action category of evidence can be used in other parts of the law, but not for CSI or TSI schools. Okay, Results for America is an organization that's put out a bunch of research. They've done a lot of studies around this evidence-based requirement. This little graphic is something that I found in one of their documents. If you want to learn more about the state of evidence-based requirements under ESSA, I strongly encourage you checking out their website. The truth is there's not a lot of guidance from the department right now about what this means or how it should be implemented. So this is Results for America. They're kind of overlaying just the law's bare requirements around evidence-based, but it doesn't necessarily get a lot deeper than that at this point because this department is not exactly regulating. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're pulling regulations back. They're not issuing a lot of guidance documents. But you can see here how the use of evidence-based changes depending on the nature of the activity, the part of the law, what's expected to be done. You can, maybe have different views of evidence-based. Of course, you can have those and how it should be used. But the law's authors clearly wanted to try to use the higher levels of evidence to turn around these schools. So I thought this continuum, this chart, was a really helpful kind of visual of thinking about what does it mean when you say evidence-based. It certainly doesn't mean the scientifically based research under No Child Left Behind. It's reminds me a little bit of the I3 investing in innovation grants that the Obama administration came out with. This evidence-based has, I think, flavors of the approach they were looking at when they were awarding grants under I3. Okay, let's keep moving on here. Let's talk about external providers. So do external providers have a role, and have states been explicit about that? Well, to a certain extent, of the first few states that got approved, there have been some specific provisions listed here. The little graph on the right is actually kind of related to the slide before, meaning do states actually identify a framework of school improvement interventions? And it kind of bridges to the external provider piece, because some states are mandating the use of external providers. Illinois has a role for them, a mandated role. California does, and I'll talk about Delaware and New York as well. There's nothing in the law that prohibits or encourages the use of external providers. It's really state policy and what they think would best serve turning around and improving these schools. If you want to take a deep dive, by the way, into any of the state plans, whether they've been approved or just submitted, that's the link that I provided right here, where you can download them, you can read to your heart's content, you can fall asleep to them, whatever you want to do with them. Throw them around at Halloween instead of toilet paper, whatever it is that you want to do with the plans, you can find them at this link. I would suggest doing a Control F search around providers, around external, around outside. Do a quick search and see if it pops up in the state plan and where it pops up. So some examples of the state policy on external providers. I talked about Illinois with their just wonderfully named Empower approach, which I don't know if anybody thought about that acronym before it rolled off their tongue, but Empower is a fantastic acronym for Illinois. And you can see here that, they're going to have to focus on one of these areas and improve. External providers have a role. If you see at the bottom of my chart, a little graph on the right-hand side, Illinois is going to require schools to pick from a list of vendors to partner on school improvement if it is needed after a certain period of time. So there's this affirmative requirement in Illinois. In Delaware, you can see here that it's similar. And now Delaware has the CSI status, which is confusing, but basically you can see that if they're not showing improvement, they're going to have to find an external partner to conduct a needs assessment at the school and district level. So slightly different role for an external provider, rather than maybe necessarily carrying out the intervention. It's more around, hey, maybe I need someone from the outside to help me figure out what the actual problem is that I need to fix. California has a requirement. You can see here, after 4 years of no improvement, you're going to have to partner with an external entity, agency, or individual. Root cause analysis. So in some respects, it's like Delaware's approach. And then in New York, it was really interesting in their plan. They kind of refer back to the priority and focus legislation and language to talk about, well, what's going to happen if a school is identified as priority under the waivers. They're going to have the ability to contract with an educational partnership organization to turn that around. And the priority, again, being the equivalent of CSI, the fact that New York put that in there, they didn't quite connect the dots this clearly, but it leads one to believe that for CSI schools, they're going to have the ability to contract with outside providers as well. And again, a lot of state plans are pretty vague on this point. They're pretty vague when it comes to CSI and TSI. Like if you were to look at state plans holistically, how they're intervening in these schools is an area where I would say the majority of states that I've looked at anyway are not very detail oriented. And I think that maybe because they're still figuring things out, they're not quite sure how this is going to play out. Some states, Massachusetts, New York, there's a few others, Tennessee, I would say, have done a much more thorough job of thinking through how will this process play out? How will we use existing state resources that we've already put in place? Maybe it was under priority and focus. Maybe it was something that we just did as a state level, and we're going to now weave that into our ESSA plan. Other states just basically say, yep, we're going to identify them every 3 years. That's going to be the lowest 5%. We're going to intervene and use evidence-based interventions. And, we hope they improve after 3 years of that. And if they do, then they're going to exit. Literally, it's that short, and they were approved. So as a former U.S. Department of Ed official, I have some opinions about whether or not the department should have probably asked for more detail, in fact, insisted on it. But I'm not anymore, and that's their call. And so in some state plans, it's maddeningly, if I could say it right, maddeningly, I still can't say it. It's very frustrating is what I'm trying to say here, the lack of detail. In that case, sometimes on state websites, if you go to their ESSA page, there may be more detail. It just wasn't included in their state plan. So if you have a state you're interested in, if you look at their state plan, you need more details, highly recommend you hitting their state ESSA state plan website, because a lot of states, whether it was based on stakeholder feedback or they're just ancillary documents that they decided not to include in their ESSA plan, may provide more information about how they're going to approach these schools. So for providers, for those of you who are in the helping schools improve business, trying to figure out what all of this means, it's still a little bit of a moving target, as I described before, but there are things you can do. So first of all, what states are you most interested in? You have to become an expert on that state's approach. You did before, but it's even more of the case under ESSA because the plans are so varied, the approaches to helping these schools are so varied. So do you know the state or states plans that you're most interested in? How are they identifying schools? What is the relative weight that they're looking at? For example, some states have really weighted growth over achievement, and they may wind up in trouble if they're not showing a lot of growth. Well, you may wind up with some higher achieving schools that are just whiffing it on growth, right? That could be identified. It is possible. So just knowing the peculiarities of how a school is going to wind up in a list of schools for CSI or TSI is really important, because the needs assessment and the interventions need to be aligned to how a school got identified. And then how does what you do, whether it's a product or a service, how does it align with those identified needs? You know, is it squarely there, or is it ancillary? Is it some of both? And do you have evidence? Can you describe, can you show how what it is you do is directly related to the problem? And do you have evidence that shows that if they use a particular product, service, strategy, approach, activity, that it has a likelihood of succeeding? Don't forget the evidence-based requirements. So Illinois and California and others are going to be requiring providers to provide what is your evidence base for what you do. And then, you know, we'll take a look at that. If you clear our evidence base, we'll put you on a list that schools either can pick from if they want, or they'll be required to pick from depending on what stage they're in. So you really have to be thoughtful around those stages of evidence, those levels of the different evidentiary requirements in the law. And that's really table stakes. And, you know, as you think about, okay, I've got the evidence, well, when you get into the work, you know, you have to be thinking about collecting data along the way to show evidence at the end of the contract that, hey, what we did produced results. Now, with CSI schools and TSI schools, some of the proof is just going to be there, because in 3 years or however long you're working with them, if they haven't improved, you're likely not going to get renewed as a contract, or they'll be off the list, which is a great success story. So you need it really in the front end and the back end of any potential engagement. What's the evidence coming in, and did it actually work out that way? Now, you know, what are sources of rigorous evidence? There's lots of different resources out there, but still not enough. And I've listed a few here. I would look at the Results for America website as well. If you want to just get a sense of what is the level of evidence for different interventions, programs, services, activities. And then obviously, if you're trying to build your evidence base, you don't have a strong one at this point, pilots are always a great way to get your foot in the door, to gather some evidence, to try some things out. Districts are normally willing. Now with improvement activities, it's more high stakes. And so getting a pilot in this context may be much more difficult. But it could be an aspect of your program or service. There could be parts of what you do that could be amenable to a pilot sort of approach. But the level of evidence, I think, will emerge. Now, I don't want to oversell that in terms of the specifics of it, because, I've heard some discussion on the Hill and elsewhere that, evidence really, the evidence-based requirements in ESSA are really meant to just weed out the stuff that really doesn't work, the bad stuff, if you will. And so with the lack of detail around what this means, it means that you've got some room to define it for yourself, but you have to have a defensible definition coming in, or I don't think you're going to get much receptivity from a state if they've got a list, from a district who may be trying to figure things out, or even from the school, because the way the needs assessment is going to be developed, the way the stakeholders are going to come into play, I mean, this is going to be a highly visible, highly accountable engagement. And so being able to come in with a strong case on the front end to say, hey, we've got really quality evidence to show that we work and we think we are a perfect fit for why this school is struggling, like that's a home run. And now that you know how the dollars are going to flow a little bit better, the ability for districts to pay for those kinds of services and products that have that level of evidence should be better than maybe it has been historically. And that's a big generalization on my part, but just that strikes me as where the market is moving in this case. Okay, I think that covers almost everything except for getting out of CSI and TSI. I've talked about this a little bit. There's a lot of state variability and frankly some bad practice that states have put in place around how do you get out of comprehensive or targeted support and improvement. Most states are looking at a 2 to 3 year. You've got to show improvement. You've got to be out of the bottom 5% for 2 or 3 years to get out. But some states are kind of loose on that. They're not totally clear on how this is all going to work out. And you can see here that, under priority and focus, the exit criteria, and even, of course, under NCLB, they were pretty rigorous, and so more and more schools got identified, not that many exited. So under ESSA, I think you're going to see more churn in these schools after 2 or 3 years. There's going to be more movement of these schools out of that status. Now, they can also be re-identified, right? There's no sort of guarantee that once you've been in it, gotten out, that you can't go right back in. You certainly can. And then, if it's not in the bottom 5%, if it doesn't meet the criteria for a certain period of time for how it initially got identified, then they're going to allow that school to exit that status. So one last question that's mostly undefined in all of the state plans I've looked at is, should there be some sort of carry-on of service for those schools after they've exited to try to prevent the backsliding that can sometimes happen? Mostly unclear. I don't think school improvement dollars would be an available use for that after a school is exited. They'd no longer be eligible. But I suspect this will be an area that will come along and there will be more discussion around how do you use those dollars, if at all, after a school is exited. And even if you can't use the school improvement dollars, how are you as a school going to use your Title I dollars to maybe carry forward some service or some use of particular products to make sure that the school doesn't get re-identified, that you don't take away critical supports right when success is really starting to take hold? I think that's a big question, and one you want to think about going in, because as I said before, the goal here is to really move these schools out of this status. They don't want them lingering there forever and ever. So being able to continue these services beyond those maybe 2 to 3 years is something to think about. Okay. Schools are exited. I'm not quite exited yet. I will certainly be willing to take some questions if you have any. That was a lot of content in a short period of time. So I am good for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Doug. This definitely was a lot of information and a lot to think about as we, try to make our plans for the coming semester as well as school year that is around the corner sooner than we'd like to think. So just a reminder to everyone before we get into the questions that have come in is that we will be sending you an email tomorrow with a link to the recording as well as the slides. So you'll be able to reference all of these numbers and the links that Doug mentioned. So don't worry if you miss writing something down, we'll get those off to you either this afternoon or first thing tomorrow. We'll also post them on the Agile website, so if that email doesn't make it to your inbox for whatever reason, just take a look at agile-ed.com and you'll be able to access the materials there as well. So we've got a couple questions that have come in, and folks, we've got time, so feel free to send in more as they come up for you. The first question is really around the plans as a whole. Is implementation on track within the states for the 2018-19 school year?
So that's a good question and hard to answer in that it depends on the state. So, you know, a lot of states who came in early had their plans approved with plenty of time. I think some of it depends on how quickly the department is going to turn around the state plans for the second set of 34, and if they're going to have enough time to get approved, get systems in place, start collecting the data in order to identify schools for 18-19. That's certainly the expectation. I would expect the vast majority of states to be approved before the end of the year. So in theory, you know, that gives you 6 months, 7, 8 months to get prepared for the next school year. But that's still not a lot of time. So it'll be tighter in the 34 states that just came in. I would say the 15 that have been approved, like, they're in great shape. And in some cases, they're already plowing ahead. I showed you Oregon, who's already sort of well underway. Now, this department did make clear in some guidance that a state is to proceed. If they don't have approval, but they've submitted a plan, they are to essentially proceed with their plan until, the department comes back and says, well, we need you to do something differently. So the expectation from the department is that a lack of approval is not an excuse to be identifying schools and getting into full implementation in 18-19.
Okay, that sounds good. And yeah, as with many answers around ESSA, there's a lot of unknowns, so we just got to roll with it. In your talking about the approved providers, do we know anything about how Illinois and other states may be going about creating that provider list, how we can get on it?
California, as far as I know, hasn't really put much out there. New York's process is what it was under the old waivers with the priority schools. So, I'm sure there's plenty of information out there on that. Delaware, I frankly just don't know. That would be something you'd want to look at their website or contact somebody in Delaware. And for Illinois, if you Google the IL-Empower, there's a web page. There's a lot of resources for you to check out. So, I would, again, take a look at your targeted states. And back to the first question about implementation, you're going to need to get a feel on a state-by-state basis of where they're at. And the states who are contemplating a role for external providers, if they don't have information up right now, you're going to have to stay on top of that state, whether it was a website or a contact that you've got there or both, so that you have, the latest and greatest, because you're not going to find all of the detail in the ESSA plans. It's really going to be a state-by-state piece. So Illinois is probably the furthest one along I've seen, so I would recommend you Google IL-Empower and check out their webpage.
I'm just reterming that Illinois Empower, Doug. I just can't say IL-Empower. It's just so bad. Yeah. Oh, goodness. All right, our next question is there any limitations or guidance around how funds can be used in terms of technology, more teachers, professional development, and do we know where that money is coming from, the state or the federal level, combination?
Okay, so school improvement grants are federal dollars. Now, whether or not the state is going to supplement that with, or even the local district will add dollars into the mix, I think in some cases they will, and I'm sorry to have to say it depends. It depends on the state. If the state is really incorporating a lot of their existing processes, structures, resources, then clearly there's going to be, you know, some state dollar, some state role. In some cases, it's just going to be the federal school improvement grants. And, you know, in terms of use of dollars, the bare minimum, right? And this is both sort of liberating and challenging all at the same time is the evidence-based requirement. So there's no specific like, hey, you know, I want to use it on all on technology or all on teachers or all on fill in the blank. The requirement is it has to meet one of those 3 levels of evidence beyond, you know, the strong theory of action. If you remember that slide where you had the 3 levels that were in the blue, it could be all spent on one activity or a combination of activities that have that level of evidence behind them. So there are not, you know, specific. Now, certainly there's, you know, existing federal law that you can't build a new school with the dollars, you can't renovate a school. Like there's certain things you can't do with the dollars, but beyond that, sort of the typical stuff you would expect to spend dollars on, there's no real limitations. It's based on the needs analysis. It's based on how the school got identified and does it meet the evidence-based requirements. Those are the 3 things that you got to look at. So it could be spent all on technology because you could have a school that doesn't have any, and they believe that the use of certain technology products or certain technology services and products will meet the needs and address the accountability reasons for the school to be identified. And it literally could all be spent on that if they could make a case for it. Now, remember, too, with comprehensive support and improvement schools, it has to be approved at the state level. So you've got multiple sort of approvers. And I would think that as you go through that process, as cumbersome and probably lengthy as it may be, you know, people will ask questions. The more eyes are on it, the more they're like, well, do you really want to put all your eggs in that one basket? Or, you know, are you spreading yourself too thin? Are you trying to put too many eggs in too many different baskets? And so there's going to be multiple kind of review cycles, and none of that's been defined at the state level yet. In fact, a lot of states are a little panicky over how are they going to approve if they've got a number of CSI schools. Like, what's their process for actually reviewing and approving? They don't want to be a rubber stamp, but they also don't want to take the process and make it last for forever and ever. So finding that sweet spot there between a rigorous review that's both timely and, you know, in time for the school year, the time for the interventions to take root is a big challenge that the states are looking at right now.
All right, and one last question, though we could probably squeeze in another one if someone has it. In terms of Title I funding that you were talking about earlier on, is that slated to decrease overall from the federal budget?
No, so Title I is slated to be flat. So there's no real extra dollars, flat to slightly positive. But remember that school improvement is taking a bigger percent than it was before. That's why the dollars that are going to flow on a normal Title I basis are going to go down. So if you've got the same pie, you're just taking a bigger slice. That means there's less for everyone else, right? So Title I looks like it's going to stay flat right around that $15 billion mark. It's just that the dollars going to school improvement coming directly out of Title I increase. So that has some ripple effects.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We've gotten a couple more questions around, are you going to get the slide deck? And the resounding answer to that is yes. So you will get all the great information that Doug put together for us that you can dive deeper into and click on those links and dig further to get your own information. Because I think one of the things we've learned here today, as we have throughout trying to unpack ESSA, is that it's going to take a lot of effort on our parts as education businesses to stay on top of what's happening and to know what's happening within each individual state. So there's a lot of onus on us to keep informed. So thank you again, Doug, for helping us become informed about this, and we look forward to having you back with us as developments continue to unfold and helping us understand what that impact is for the education marketplace. As a reminder to everyone else, we've got our next webinar coming up really fast on November 14th, and we're going to be joined by the folks over at Fable Vision, who are extremely talented and creative, and they're going to be talking to us about using video to support teacher professional learning and development as a way to also, ensure your products are implemented successfully and therefore get renewed. So keep an eye on your inbox for information on that, as well as the Agile website about how to register. We'll be opening up registration tomorrow, actually. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.